Gracious, all-knowing God, you show us how to see into corners and notice those on the margins through Jesus' ministry in Capernaum. You saw and healed Peter's mother-in-law, Lord, and we know there's really only one way to get one of those. So help us, God, to see Peter's wife and all the other women, children, and men of Galilee who loved Jesus and served and helped him in his ministry. Help us always to notice, loving God, all those we don't see, those who are hidden behind the side of the road, outside the door, under a burden, on the edge of the crowd, or behind our assumptions, and to see you in their eyes. We ask all this in your holy name. Amen. Please be seated. About a year and a half ago, I became a mother-in-law. Not once, but twice. And by my own doing, too. As I was both the officiant and the mother, first of the bride, my daughter Aubrey, in the mountains of northeast Georgia, as she married Nick, and then our son Judson in New Orleans as he married Sophia. While looking through Emmanuel's zip files last week, probably Thursday or so, for plans of the chancel area, ask me about that. That's another whole story. Ask me about that at announcements. I came upon a video of Aubrey and Nick's wedding in June of 2022, and I got lost in that happy day for about 20 minutes. After the proclamation of marriage, where the officiant says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," that close-up of the video, you can see me exchanging this mischievous glance with my brand new, at that moment, son-in-law, Nick. Yep, you just married me too. We're all family now. And I went a step further after Sophia and Judson's wedding in New Orleans, introducing Sophia as my brand new daughter-in-law with her husband, Judson Wells, claiming my place in that family. Mothers-in-law are often known by role and not by name, and those of us who have been them or have them can know there can be that weird discomfort about the name in the early days of marriage, wondering what to call your mother-in-law. A problem that is often solved by grandchildren. I think my name is Dee Dee now, thank the Lord, as Mrs. Wells just is not a big enough idea to contain all that we are now to one another, me and my kids' spouses. Even accounting for different life experiences, marital outcomes, choices, and contexts, knowing of, or having, or being a mother-in-law is a very common experience. And even if you're not a mother-in-law like I am, or if you don't have one now, maybe you once did. Or maybe you have a parent and a grandmother who was an in-law, mother-in-law to that parent. In any case, it's a special relationship, official and legally recognized, as well as personal and familial. And many of Jesus' first disciples were related. Simon Peter and Andrew were brothers, as were James and John. And remember, this Simon we talk about in today's gospel reading is Peter. Jesus renames him Cephas, Peter, the rock. And we know from other stories in the gospel that Jesus himself had brothers who were involved in the ministry and was also very close to Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And all those family relationships, which makes sense, all those are family relationships. And as preacher Lawrence Wood reflects, because the church early on was very much a family affair, just as it is now. We grow person by person, one person at a time. There's something more and different, though, going on in today's gospel, where Simon Peter's mother-in-law is the central point of the story. With his brother Andrew and the brothers James and John of Zebedee in tow, Simon Peter enters his house with Jesus. Simon Peter's mother-in-law is in bed with a fever, Mark's gospel tells us. And the two pairs of brothers, Simon Peter and Andrew, and James and John, crowded into Simon Peter's house and told Jesus about Simon Peter's sick mother-in-law in bed right away. I wonder what her name was. Naomi, Tabitha, Martha, Mary, or maybe Dee Dee like me, or another grandmother name. Mark's gospel doesn't say, but instead it describes her relationship with Simon Peter, his mother-in-law, and not by her name, her family origin, her hometown. Was she a Galilean? We don't know. Identifying Simon Peter's mother-in-law by her role does something else. It reveals the warp and the weave of the very fabric of the community. Because if instead she had been Simon Peter's mother, she would have been Andrew's mother too. But as it was, she was not related by blood to either one of them, but instead was chosen family, official and legally recognized, as well as personal and familial. We also know that while mothers-in-law are common, there's pretty much only one way to get one. So Simon Peter must have had, at least once have had, a wife. And if he had a wife, did he have children? Did Simon Peter's brother Andrew have a mother-in-law? And did she have her own grandmother name? Meaning a house full of cousins and another whole family line connected to Peter? The story of Jesus' healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law frames the whole project of healing and driving out demons that unfolds next. I've spent a lot of time around the archaeological site in Capernaum where the church remembers Peter's house by the Sea of Galilee. And even after that small stone house on the edge of the sea was built up in the 5th century into a pilgrimage church, it was really very small. Probably not much bigger than the area of the chancel where the choir sits now, without including the altar area. And into that tiny space, no fewer than 5 men entered, where a woman, unrelated to any of them by blood, lay in bed with a fever, which almost 2,000 years ago, before the advent of penicillin, could well have led to her death. Then Jesus, a Jewish man, risked ritual impurity and dangerous contagion to go to her bedside. A brave, loving, familiar thing to do, sort of thing a family member might do. Even though she was not his mother-in-law or his mother, and specifically not related to Simon Peter and definitely not related to Jesus, Jesus took Simon Peter's mother-in-law by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, before we bring our 21st century understandings and eyes and attitudes to that verb serve, let's note that in the biblical Greek, the verb is dikanie, which directly forms the word deacon. Simon Peter's mother-in-law was the first to respond, as so many others would, profoundly moved by this great change in her life, becoming the first deacon in the sense of becoming a servant to all, in response to Jesus' radically inclusive love. Jesus' love is boundless, including not only blood family or first century Galilean Jews under Roman occupation, but particularly and specifically those who are outside blood relatives and other privileged relationship or status categories, like Simon Peter's mother-in-law. We don't even know her name, but Jesus heals her all the same. Like our reading from Isaiah this morning describes God's care for each of us, he brings them out and he numbers them, calling them all by name. And because he is great in strength and mighty in power, not one is missing, including all of us listening in now. And this is our message from 1 Corinthians 2, as Paul becomes all things to all people, crossing all kinds of lines and differences in order to win some in this radical course of love that is open to everyone. Even to us in-laws and outlaws, as I've sometimes heard us called, all for the sake of the gospel, so we can all share in its blessings. Amen.